Well, first of all, can I apologise to everyone? Something technical has happened, which is beyond my comprehension, but it is a delayed matter, so please forgive us in respect of that. My name's James Daly. I'm a member of Parliament for Bury North. I'm the joint chair of the APPG for Northern Culture. This is our third evidence session, and it's an inquiry into the cultural value of sport to the North cities, towns, and communities. For the MP for Bury, with the loss of a football club and the loss of a 130-year-old stadium, this is something that's been very prevalent in my community, and I know Howard very well, and Howard obviously knows about that situation very well. So we believe as a grouping that sport is a key social, economic positive for every town, village and city in the UK, and I'm very glad that you're able to join us today. So without further delay, we are going to get straight down to the evidence session, if that's okay. I think we set out the aims of why everyone is here, and the first speaker that we have is Sir Howard Bernstein. Howard.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and thanks for the introduction. I submitted some evidence which tried to emphasise the importance of the heritage value, particularly of football clubs as well as other sports organisations, whether they're large or small. Also not just because of their heritage value, but also because of their capacity to be engines of growth of community achievement. I've been associated particularly with two football clubs over my career. One of them, I think, is one of the best examples to be found anywhere in the world, Manchester City, where it's played absolutely central role, certainly over the last decade, in the wider regeneration of East Manchester. But that's not the only example of where a vibrant ownership of a football club is breathing new life in towns. I'm particularly pleased that Ken Knott has been able to join us. Ken is the chair of Stockport County Football Club. And one of the things we've done is provide you with some clear evidence about how under new ownership, Stockport County is actually not only securing on-field success, but is also delivering wider community benefits. Part of the evidence I gave also identified the way in which I think we need to incentivise this type of ownership and the outcomes in the future. I gave a number of examples. One of them is around how we support proper place planning by local authorities as part of their wider place leadership role. Sport and culture has got a fundamental role to play in those place plans. I also identified how the existing fragmented nature of funding sources could be joined up much better at place level, local level. Skills, education, health, sport, big challenge of the national system to do this, as we all know. I think there's more for us to promote in those sorts of areas. We talk about devolution a lot. As you know, Chair, I've been involved in many devolution discussions over my career. Very rarely have any of those discussions extended to the importance of sport and culture and which local authorities with active central and Sport England support actually support change. I've also given a couple of other examples about how we can incentivise new development, particularly around how we account for land value, particularly where community facilities are concerned. Community hubs, the sorts of things that Ken is trying to deliver in the wider Cheshire South area are not capable of being located in towns or city centres. So how we actually support change, particularly on the periphery of areas, I think is very important. Business rates is another example I would give, where if it's linked to rateable value, you can just incentivise football clubs or to actually invest in education and community facilities. And one final area which I think needs further discussion is around subsidy controls. I've had recent experience through my association with Lancashire Cricket and working very closely with Lancashire County Council. It came as a great surprise to me to find out that sport and leisure were not exempted from the existing arrangements, which further therefore adds uncertainty in the way in which we plan and deliver community-based outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Howard. I should have said, Sir Howard was Chief Executive of Manchester City Council from 1998 to 2017. However, in my part of the world, everybody knows who Howard is, so it doesn't normally need an introduction as such. So forgive me, Howard, that I didn't give you your full back history. Ken, thank you very much for joining us. There was a debate in Parliament, which I think some of the MPs here were part of, and it was discussing the situation with Derby County. Now, thankfully, that seems to have resolved itself. And one of the comments I made in that debate was, we cannot treat football clubs like a local branch of Tesco's, in the sense that they are, if you view them as businesses or independent businesses, they are uniquely placed in the community and have a unique character. Now, in terms of what you've done at Stockport, can you just tell us a brief background to that and what's happened?
Yeah, back in January 2020, a wealthy entrepreneur who I've worked with for over a decade decided to buy the football club. He has the wealth to be able to do that, but he had a very clear vision that he wanted to create, in his words, a modern football club for the modern era, one which maximizes its contribution to the social, economic and cultural well-being of the town that it represents. And that required a vision that, part of which was obviously investing on the footballing side of the equation for obvious reasons, but also on the community and education platforms that we are advancing. And in the period since we acquired the club, we've had one promotion from the National League into the Football League. And what that demonstrated to me was the phenomenal impact that a successful local club can have on its community. It's absolutely unbelievable, the impact, the reach that it has into the community, and football clubs are uniquely placed to have that reach. So in parallel with the footballing side of the equation, I'm very much focusing on developing the education platform, where, working with the local authority at Stockport, MBC, we've got a partnership going in the east of the borough at Woodley, where we're educating 180 16 to 18-year-olds on BTEC sports education, and we're trying to advance plans, which Howard alluded to briefly, in Cheshire East Council, to bring forward a site for a new community education and elite training campus, which would have the potential to enroll up to 500 students studying in this area. And we've unlocked that there's huge latent demand. We're also investing heavily in our community trust, chaired by John Stevenson MBE, where we're expanding very considerably our reach in terms of social well-being into the more vulnerable parts of the community that surround the football club. And again, I repeat the point I made earlier, football clubs are uniquely placed to have that reach. That's one of the things that we've learned. And you'll all be aware of the white paper the government's recently published on potentially reforming the finances in football. That is absolutely critical to the long-term sustainability of football clubs in the English football leagues 1 and 2 in the Championship, because the current football pyramid is failing considerably.
Yeah. No, I think we can certainly agree on that, and I think others will talk about that. Can I thank Eve and Duncan for joining the chat? You've got, I don't know whether you know, Duncan McVeigh has said, Ken, that he's a county season ticket holder, so very much supports everything that you've said. Can I just ask one? We're going to come back to questions from the MPs and people in the room, and also some other questions later. But the initial, when Stockport County got into trouble initially, what was the role of the council in ensuring its survival at the start point of the journey?
The role of the pivotal role the council played in 2016 was to acquire Edgeley Park Stadium off the football club, thus giving it the financial stability with the supporter cooperative to stay in business and not disappear.
And the point I think that we're all looking and seeing Stockport as the example is that investment by a state body, by a council, it could be anything, but by a council, the value added that you've just described as a result of that investment is incredible, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think we're only scratching the surface, Chairman. I really do. I think there's so much more that we can achieve. We're in the process of acquiring the stadium back as part of our plans to grow and expand the stadium. We need an investable platform, and the ground should be quite rightly held in the ownership of the club that plays from that venue, in our opinion.
Ken, that is genuinely inspiring. I think people who don't know about Stockport should look at it more closely because it is really the blueprint of where football should go, I believe. Anyway, and obviously, you know the situation in Bury, and hopefully, fingers and toes crossed, it gives an example of what can happen. We'll come back to you in a second. Can I now go to John Dutton? Now, John, we've met before, John. That I'm originally from Huddersfield. And to say I'm passionate about rugby league is the understatement of the century. Huddersfield Giants man through and through. One of the things about rugby league in a town like mine is that, in the town I'm originally from, you know, we're talking about the best part of 200,000 people in the borough of Kirklees and in Huddersfield. And Huddersfield Giants are struggling in terms of attendances, as you know, to get people through the door. And the really sad thing about that is the product and the value that rugby league adds to its local community is absolutely immense. So I wonder if you could talk about not only about the success of the World Cup, about what work you're doing, you know, in rugby league, but how you feel that we can all get behind this. This is my own personal plea. So any opportunity to talk about rugby league is how we can support rugby league in the community and the good work that rugby league can do in communities across the north. John, the floor is yours.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Good morning, James. Good morning, everyone. So I'm here predominantly to talk about the Rugby League World Cup. Also, just to say, James, I am a member of the UK Sport Major Event Panel that are looking very seriously about government investment into major events being purpose-led. And I can say hand on heart that we have delivered a tournament with a purpose. What happens off the field, equal attention was given to what happens on the field. The tournament was delivered last autumn following postponements. We had 32 teams representing 20 different nations. And for the first time ever, we delivered a wholly inclusive tournament with men, women and wheelchair athletes being equal across absolutely everything, including prize money and participation fees. It was a celebration of the North, 21 venues. We started in Newcastle, we finished in Manchester, and 18 host towns and cities, but 86% of the games played in the north of England. We achieved a cumulative TV audience of 30 million people watching rugby league, many for the first time, and just under 500,000 spectators in the venues, including our evening in Huddersfield. But most importantly, our objective was to tackle inequalities through providing opportunities with a very significant social impact programme focused on social mobility. And we prefer to talk about social impact rather than legacy. We know we have left a legacy, and to focus on what happens in local communities rather than participation per se. And as you said, James, the connection between local people and rugby league is inextricably linked in many northern towns. So we devised a theory of change model for a social impact programme focusing on 6 areas, and I think they touch on some of the questions that have been posed. Stimulating physical activity, improving mental fitness, developing people, creating stronger communities, boosting the economy and growing the game. And next month, in about 3 weeks' time, we publish our final evaluation piece, which will talk about all of those different things. So specifically, cultural value, civic pride, people and place was our focus. So when we went to many northern towns, Huddersfield, but in particular Leigh, Warrington, St Helens, it is the only time that a World Championship, a World Cup, a tournament of global proportions is likely to come to those towns and cities. And it is fair to say from the evaluation that people were incredibly proud of their place and incredibly proud that such a major significant global event was coming. We have seen through the wheelchair participation and through women's participation that increase, and many new clubs, new teams being set up. There are no more new girls playing rugby league than new boys, which I think is a statistic that we'll be very proud of. So just with regard to the North, the Rugby League was born in 1895, well documented in how it was born in Huddersfield. But we now, 128 years later, are very proud to have delivered the first ever purposeful tournament and the most inclusive sporting tournament in the sport's history. Thank you very much, James.
Thank you, John. We'll come back to you with some further questions, some further thoughts. But can I now go to Yvonne Harrison? Yvonne is the CEO of Women in Football. Yvonne, welcome.
Morning, everyone, and thanks for the opportunity today. So, yeah, I represent the view, obviously, as CEO of Women in Football, but it's also important to say I'm a Stockport resident, Ken.
Good.
I've lived in Greater Manchester my whole life and worked in grassroots sports for a long time in Greater Manchester at an active partnership called Greater Sport. And I also currently chair a community organisation for football, Foundation 92, which is the official charity of Salford City. So I guess I bring a few different lenses as other panelists will. I think the thing for me is that sport, as we've heard, can bring people together. It gives communities, individuals a sense of identity, a sense of belonging. And it's absolutely deep-rooted in the heart and heritage of the North. And I think it's something we're all proud of. As Ken touched upon, you know, it teaches life skills, not just skills on the field. Resilience, equality, inclusion, respect, team building, all of these things. It has a huge role to play in terms of education, and it can draw people to education. When we look at the institutions, particularly higher institutions within the North, coupled with iconic sporting clubs and national teams. If we look at the epicenter of national teams and venues in Manchester as an example, you know, it attracts people into the North, and many people stay. You know, they learn here, they choose to stay here, and then ultimately they're contributing to our economy, which is obviously hugely significant. The sports industry in and of itself, it creates thousands and thousands of jobs, you know, from entry level, and that's really important when we look at accessibility and equality within our communities, but also right up to the boardroom. And whilst it attracts talent, I think the North is brilliant at developing our own as well, and that's something that's really important. I think sport can be watched, it can be played, it can be volunteered in, and it can be worked in at grassroots elite on or off the field. And this is hugely important because what that means is it gives everybody the opportunity to access and engage in some way. And John touched upon that as well. I think sport reflects and creates community, and this is really important. And certain sports are closely linked to communities and reflect the characteristics and traditions of those communities. It very much can break down barriers. Everyone on this call will absolutely know that. And it can support cohesion, people connecting from different cultures on the field of play, and really just making sure that that's a non-confrontational environment where everybody can be equal. And when it comes to tackling social issues, contributing to the Sustainable Development Goals as an example, sport has a huge role to play in health and well-being, in quality education, in gender equality, which is obviously something that Women in Football deals with every day, reducing inequalities and creating fantastic work and growth. And actually, these are real significant challenges for parts of the North, particularly when we look at reducing demand on public services. So its value is not to be underestimated. When we look at, in particular, football, obviously that has a significant contribution to make, both in terms of the economic and social contribution. And we have, you know, a steeped history in terms of football, and there are multiple reports, whether that's UEFA Sport England, looking at that social return on investment. I'm sure colleagues will be aware of that. The Premier League does invest beyond the elite, and I think that's really important, investing into communities and society. Never mind the, you know, match day activity and what that draws into towns and cities across the North. I think football is part of the cultural DNA of northern towns and cities. When we look at women's football in particular, you know, the first professional league in this country was 2018 after a significant ban of women playing, and that Barclays Women's Super League and Championship now, and of course the success of the Lionesses has been very visible for all to see. And I think John's obviously touched on that brilliantly in terms of the Rugby League World Cup being super inclusive, and we definitely felt that with the Women's Euros, but what that required was investment. It required legacy planning or social impact in advance of the event. I think both of these events that have been mentioned have done that absolutely brilliantly. When we look at the Women's Euros, you know, more than 500,000 opportunities for women and girls, new opportunities to play, 1,500 volunteers, 9 host cities, school programs, and 120,000 regular opportunities for girls to play. And again, this is super important because that regularity, that normality of girls playing football or sport, in fact, is hugely important when we think of health and well-being and the state of our towns and cities. I think from a point of view of women's sport, and this is really an interesting fact in a piece of research that was done recently, fans of women's sport are very much demanding of this purpose-driven approach from brands. So I think there's a really interesting thing around not only public sector, but also private sector investment. And Ken touched upon this, you know, into sport and having a meaning and a purpose beyond, you know, just winning on the field of play. And this is hugely important. Fans of women's sport, 50% believe that brands should act with purpose. We've seen the impact of the Lionesses, whether that's Leah Williamson and her teammates fighting for equal access for girls in school. It's quite obvious not every girl will want to play football, but every girl should have the choice to play. And that social impact, that piece, the value that those players, and we've seen other players, particularly in football, but other sports as well, really fighting for equality and impacting on society, which is massively, massively important. I think just to sort of finish, I guess, in terms of my view, social return on investment is likely to be higher when it's related to women and girls because their current levels of participation are lower than their male counterparts. So for me, sport's not only an essential part of that economic and social fabric of the North, women's sport has got a growing role to play in this, and I would welcome, you know, people's thoughts on that. In terms of the key principles, and something that we've not yet touched upon, but I'm sure all colleagues would agree. When we are looking at the role that sport has to play in culture and the economy, we've got to engage our communities. So Howard talked about place planning. This is so important. You know, gone are the days where we're just going to drop a programme in and do to communities. It's really important we engage our communities in the design and the delivery of these cultural and sports programs at the start, and we've got to create the conditions for this, and that might be changing the way we do things. And obviously I was born in Gorton, you know, I'm a Mancunian, I live in Stockport. I'm very proud of Greater Manchester and the North, and it's really important that we challenge the way that things are currently delivered. You know, we might need to dismantle governance systems and reshape them, look at devolution, look at that, what that's teaching us, processes that are getting in the way of levelling up, because to be honest, things should be working from the bottom up. And there's some great examples of that, where we look at, in Greater Manchester as an example, the health strategy aligning and sport feeding into that. This is about people in communities being inspired, engaged in some way and moving more. It doesn't mean you have to be an elite athlete. That's not what any of us would say, but that does provide inspiration for some. And for others, it provides connectivity. It gives them a reason not to be isolated, to get out of the house once a week and go and watch their local cricket team, netball team, you know, however that works. And of course, it goes without saying that diversity in the workforce is really, really important. If we're going to reduce inequalities and we're really going to tackle that, it's very important that the workforce that's engaging with our communities is from the community and represents the community. And I think that's where sport both does really well, but also has some significant challenges when we look at gender in boardrooms, for example, in football. Women are massively underrepresented, and yet we're not underrepresented in society. We're over 50% of the population. So there's a whole range of things to do, but long-term planning, not quick fixes, really engaging bottom up with the community and listening to what they want and need will ensure, you know, sustainability, longevity, and keep sport right at the heart of our cultural fabric.
Thank you very much indeed, Yvonne. We will be coming back to discuss some of those issues in a second. We're going to go from it seems to be a Greater Manchester balance on this panel at the moment. So we're going to go from Greater Manchester to South Yorkshire to my colleague Clive Betts MP. Clive, among many, many other things, is the chairman of the Levelling Up Housing and Community Select Committee. Clive.
Thank you. And just say hello to Howard. we're continuing the fight for devolution, Howard, that we've talked about many times over the years. All I'll just say to you, Howard, if all that comes out of as many resources as Manchester City, I'm sure we could do a lot as well, but that's just a bit tongue-in-cheek at the beginning. I think about where most of us began with football. For me, it was walking a mile and a half to the ground at Hillsborough with my grandfather, my father, my uncle, my cousin. It was a family affair, it was a community affair, and people went to the club that generations of the family had supported. It was just what you did. It was our own form of culture, if you like. And anyone who went and stood on a football ground in those days, and I sometimes wonder about the safety aspects of what used to happen in the 1950s and 60s, with 65,000 in a smaller Hillsborough as it was then. And that sense of togetherness, that sense of belonging, that sense it was your club. It wasn't the boss's club, it wasn't the owner's club, it was your club. And I always felt if Sheffield Wednesday went out of business, what would I do on a Saturday afternoon? I wouldn't go and support the other lot on the other side of the city. I'd probably go in the garden because there's only one club you can support. It's absolutely right, isn't it? It's you Tesco shuts down, you go and shop at Sainsbury's or somewhere. Yeah, it's totally different with the football club. And I think that sense of belonging and community is really important. And you have to experience it. You hear the cop at Liverpool with You Never Walk Alone. You go to Pamela, I have to mention them occasionally, and you listen to the Chick Bucky song or the I.O. Sheffield Wednesday, and that sense of coming together, that sense of feeling, that sense of belonging is a community's culture. I used to sometimes tease some of my more artistic friends and say, there's far more people got culture on a Saturday afternoon, either Hillsborough, Bramall Lane, than ever got it from art galleries. But I mean, again, that's probably very tongue-in-cheek, but for many people, that's what their lives were. That's their experience. That's how they related to their fellows. And that's how they experienced it. And I think we should never absolutely underestimate that at all. So really important what's been talked about in terms of the sustainability of football clubs, the fair funding arrangements, making sure that clubs lower down the league are sustainable. There's more people every Saturday afternoon go to watch EFL clubs and go to watch Premier League clubs. We shouldn't forget that. And they're spread around the country in many places. Unfortunately, Bury is one that isn't now, but hopefully will be again one day. So that's sustainability. The right of football fans, and I say it's their club, to have a veto over name changes, over colour changes, over ground changes, the things that actually make a football club, the part of the inheritance of it, the part of the inheritance of those individuals who support the club en masse. So I just don't always think, the importance for people of football can't be underestimated. Who else would people choose to spend their Saturday afternoons at a form of entertainment where most of the time you lose? I mean, it's something that yes, you've got to be committed. You've got to really feel it's part of your life. But it's wider than that, isn't it? Because we're talking about football clubs in the professional sense. But it's beyond that. Certainly growing up in Sheffield, I remember the works football leagues. People went into the works. They went as kids. They went as apprentices. They worked during the week in often difficult, dirty, sometimes dangerous jobs. And Saturday afternoon they went to play for the works football team and the works cricket team in the summer, which we got back cricket in that. And they went to the works social club on a Saturday evening. And that sense of togetherness again is something very important. I think in working class northern culture that came about has changed over the years, but it's part of the background of our areas. And in some ways that's gone on to be reflected in junior football now. Sheffield has the largest junior football league in Europe, and it's absolutely massive. And your number of kids playing now on a Sunday morning, despite sometimes the facilities aren't as good as you might want them to be, though the FA are investing in the St George's Park arrangements now, which I've got a brilliant one in my constituency. And the interesting there is, because I've talked mainly about men's involvement so far, I appreciate, it is the number of girls now playing at a local level. I go down to Lisbon Bowler Centre in my constituency, and watch that half the number of young people playing from 6 and 7 up to 18 are now women, girls and women. And I think that is a change as well. And it's that wider involvement in those activities. And we shouldn't underestimate that involvement in amateur sport and kids coming together, kids feeling a sense of belonging to their team and going out to their club nights and celebrate, to do awards. All that side of it, when you talk to young people, is a really important issue, an important way of young people getting activities when perhaps some of them might be doing other less desirable things if that opportunity wasn't there for them. So I think it's wider than just professional clubs. It's out there with our communities and what happens there. And certainly professional clubs now are doing more outreach into the communities, more engagement. And that's really worthwhile in a way that didn't happen in the 1950s and 60s. You simply went to the game, turned up, and that was it. And I think that's certainly a very welcome addition, bringing the professional and the communities together.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. Thank you very much indeed, Clive, for that. I have one of the officers of our APPG, Paul Howard, my colleague from Sedgefield. Paul, what's your views on what we've heard so far?
Well, I could just repeat everything that's been said. If you like, I mean, as a Newcastle fan, then I would obviously empathise with the way community engaged when you've got the right ownership in terms of just the way that they connect with the community. Not saying not getting into the politics of it, but the fact that all of a sudden going to Newcastle United, there's a thing now with flags and everything is absolutely a bought-in thing by the community as a whole in terms of what they're doing. The other end of the spectrum, I would go back. I mean, my constituency of Sedgefield is half in the Durham County and half in the borough of Darlington. Darlington is an example of a club that collapsed. They collapsed because they had the wrong owner who built a stadium that was far too big. The whole financial thing imploded. Then they went down, I think about 7 leagues that got pushed down and everything like that. Again, you can question the proportion of that. Yeah. But the importance of that club is, they actually had to go and play from Bishop Auckland, they went to, and then they've come back and they're just now trying to work back through the pyramid. As it happens, the rugby club is now owning the stadium that caused them to implode, and I'm not sure where the rugby club's heading to at this point in time. But I don't know whether you know, but one of your quiz questions of the week would be, what is the biggest dedicated rugby club in the UK apart from in England? Sorry, apart from Twickenham.
Right.
And it's actually Mountain Park in Darlington.
Well, there we go.
It's a rugby union.
Okay.
Club. So we've got a lot of empathy as to what's going on, and I absolutely agree with what your comments, Chair, in terms of they are more than businesses.
Okay.
They are the connection to the communities. And I was in the late 60s, early 70s, probably when I first went to football grounds, and the way we were treated as fans at Newcastle was just in and out.
He's still wet.
We're on the same boat, aren't you? You don't have ground.
Yeah.
And you're stuck from there on in, as to where it is. But I've got another little local club in Newcastle, which is on the cusp of possibly winning their league. It's between them and Ashington, and everybody engages at that level, don't they? And so it just.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul. What this inquiry really is about is the link between state bodies, state money, and sport and heritage, and how you can leverage that money to benefit the wider community. Now, I'm going to pose a few questions in respect to this, which covers some of the things we've been talking about. But one of the things that I'm concerned about is ghettoising the sport, because I feel, and I'll use cricket as the example, that if you live in a more deprived area, but more disadvantaged area, that your access to sport is a lot less than your middle class counterpart. I could give a list here of numerous cricket clubs. I'll give one example, a team called Bradley Mills in Huddersfield, formed in the 1870s, in a very disadvantaged part of Huddersfield, thrived through 2 world wars, the Great Depression, everything that life threw at it. But something in modern society meant that club folded in the 1990s. And I could produce a list here in every county in the country as to why, or arguing as to why clubs in disadvantaged areas is a concern. So Howard, I'll give you an example. So Howard knows Radcliffe Cricket Club very well. I'm sure Ken knows it as well, and Yvonne. You know, this is an unbelievable facility, a huge cricket ground, a beautiful place. This is where Gary Sobers, Frank Worrell played. They can't raise one team at this moment in time. You know, the town of Radcliffe that surrounds it is thousands of people, but the club cannot raise one team. And so I just throw that question up to you. Do you think I'm right in respect to that? Do you think there is a concern that, you know, we're essentially investing in middle class areas and giving, you know, sport to middle class parents and families, or am I wrong in respect to that, Howard?
I think that's partly right, James, if I'm being honest with you. I think the other issue as well is that cricket has got, I think, historically an uneven track record in how it does outreach work and how it supports community cricket. I know what we're trying to do in Lancashire cricket is not necessarily the norm elsewhere. And we've seen some of the problems around Yorkshire, and it's not just the well-documented ones, but it's only comparatively recently that they've actually stopped charging people to play community cricket and create those pathways. So I do think there are big issues around how we connect with deprived community, and some sports are better than others. It has to be said at that.
Yeah. John, where rugby league, I mean, I don't know what you feel in the sense of somebody who's passionate about rugby league. I know the value that brings to the local community. Now, sometimes rugby league has struggled to make its presence felt, but I just wonder what your view is in how we can support. You know, we're all MPs here. We all want to see rugby league thrive. We all want to make sure that it has the widest possible reach because of the good work it does. I mean, what do you think we should be doing to help the sport?
Yeah, I think, James, excuse me, that rugby league is played in some of the hardest to reach areas. So we did a piece of work looking at the indices of multiple deprivation and the funding that we've received from a grant perspective to put that back into local communities. And the target was predominantly the top 30%. The results will show that we mainly invested in the top 10% on IMD, and that just intrinsically shows that connection between hard to reach communities and the sport of rugby league. I think the problem is complex and multifaceted. So if you take other sports, cricket, tennis, etc., it's about access, but it's also then about facilities and welcoming environments. It's about volunteers. It's about coaches. If you look at it from a holistic perspective, it's a multifaceted challenge. And I think what we try to do with the Rugby League World Cup is use a tournament as the vehicle to address some of the sports challenges. Sport, very few asset owning communities, so investments into bricks and mortar. Challenges around kit and equipment and investment into that. And then in a volunteer program that was based on local people. So we've seen many other sports events be very successful with volunteers, but predominantly those people were almost professional volunteers and not from the local community. And that's where we've tried to look at that from an inclusive perspective. So I think in summary, James, I think Rugby League does a lot of good things in the local communities because of the hard to reach areas. And I think other sports have many, many challenges, not least the quality of community facilities.
Ken, I'm just going to go back to something that Clive said. I'm sure Clive can comment on this as well. Is that what makes football in particular, the sport, quite unique in communities is, and we as constituency MPs know this, that it's the only vehicle where you can get thousands of people from different backgrounds, from living different, potentially, different streets, and have all sorts of different experiences, different ages, different sexes in one place. No, unless somebody's going to contradict me, I don't think there is another way that we can do that. So in Bury, and let us hope we're going to be back to this very soon, that whether it's 3,000-4,000 people, 8, even 5, there is no other means by which we can get those people together. So the question that raises is, from a state point of view, from a politician point of view, if you've got 5,000 people together in one place every 2 weeks, how do we use that for the greater good? Now, you've already commented on this, but I just wondered, what your general advice or viewpoint in respect to other towns other than Stockport is.
Well, football is uniquely placed because of our national infrastructure and the history and heritage, but we've witnessed at Stockport County taking average crowds from 2,500 when we acquired the club up to 8.5 to 10,000 in the last 6 to 9 months. So you're right, the reach that it has is absolutely phenomenal. And I think it's up to the owners and the boards to develop a broad-based community-facing agenda that looks to maximize the outreach programs through community, through health, through education. And where government can help, I think, is direct some of its investment through levelling up funds towards football clubs who are doing the right things in their communities because of the disproportionately beneficial impact that can have. I think it was just referred to that facilities is a major problem. And if I look at the facilities available for grassroots football clubs around Stockport and North Cheshire, it's woeful for the demand that's out there for those facilities. And yet there are levelling up funds being allocated, and those funds need to be much more directed and aligned to cultural and sporting institutions that have sound strategies to outreach into their communities.
Absolutely.
Chair, would it be okay to just add to that? I think it's a really, really good point that's made there, because facilities are very significant in terms of participation. And to John's point, that welcoming approach, when you go to somewhere new, particularly if you're an adult returning to sport, it is quite a scary thing. And I think from a point of view of the growth of women's sport, not just football, but right across the board, women's sport is growing. We've seen that through some of the amazing work that Sport England have invested in. There is a really important point here around access to facilities. So of the existing facility stock that we have, what typically can happen is, if I take football as the example, men's teams and boys' teams have been on those pitches for years and years and years. And now there is a growth in women and girls playing football, and actually they can't access the facilities. Or if they can, they're accessing facilities late at night, the worst quality pitch, the pitch that's right at the back by the trees and there's not good lighting. And actually, when we think about safety of women and girls, that's a real challenge and a real issue. So I think in terms of not only, yes, more investment is required to level up when it comes to facilities across the board for sport, but special sort of consideration needs to be made around access to existing facilities. And for new facilities being built, what access is going to be provided to women and girls, because they haven't got that history of bookings, for years and years and years. It's a real problem in the women's game.
But somebody on the chat, and forgive me, the name hasn't come up. This is a point that I'm sure John could quote me some figures as well. But the Women's Euros 2022 was unique, as it had a cultural and arts heritage strand running alongside the tournament. Sheffield's economy, as one of the 9 host cities, was boosted by £8.3 million. £8.3 million. And I'm sure that various places for the Rugby League World Cup could do that. So I just wonder about what you think in terms, obviously, the Women's Euros is a unique tournament, but how can we look at that as the model and encourage more, I don't know whether you call it competitions or more events which have this power to boost the local economy whilst also doing the wider good? Are we going to have to wait another 30 years for an event, that celebrates women's football, do you think? Or what should we be doing to try to address that point?
If you look specifically at women's football, yes, the Women's Euros was unbelievable. And actually what's really interesting in the women's football space, and UEFA produced a report not that long ago around this, is the growing fan base. So right across Europe, this growing fan base, I think expected to be 328 million fans of women's football by 2033. And interestingly, 1 in 3 of those fans are new to football, full stop. So not just new to women's football, but new to football. I think in terms of major events, it's about how we harness the power of those, whether they're, a home event like the Rugby League World Cup or the Women's Euros or not. So we've got the Women's World Cup in Australia shortly. What can we do in the north to celebrate that, to bring people together into cities, into towns? We've seen Manchester, and forgive me, it's where I live, but we've seen Manchester do this incredibly well. Big screens in city centres, drawing people in for weekends, celebrations, festivals. I think the Rugby League was another great example where you've got a real family audience. And people will come for the weekend with their families to places that they've not been. The key for that, I think, and that sustained economic impact, however, is the legacy planning, because, you know, within the Euros, you know, lots and lots more people, women were trained as coaches, as officials, as volunteers. And this is really important because ultimately they will continue to do that and then continue to provide at that grassroots level. Some of them may even come into working in football. So it's not just about the delivery of those events, it's about the stuff that sort of wraps around, and then also how we harness the power, the pride. We all know what it's like when the Men's World Cup was on, you know, everyone's kind of behind the team, and going back to John's point around civic pride, you know, we really have that. So it's about celebrating in localities, and obviously maximising in those areas where it can be done well and safely, and where there is that infrastructure to support, making sure we connect to these events.
Thank you very much indeed, Yvonne. Clive, you can see the words as well as I can, hopefully, in front of me, but this is from Lindsay Finlay-King, and Lindsay says, we need, from the University of Northumbria, we need to look at the crisis in community sports clubs. Pressure to run in a professional way now for many years from national sports associations, pandemic, cost of living crisis, volunteer recruitment, fluctuation, and most importantly, the cost of facility access for clubs. So I don't know whether you see that, Clive, but it's about a potential crisis in community sports clubs. Do you see that? Do you see a thriving sector in your area?
I think the junior sports club are actually doing pretty well. I mean, that's, you know, I think the development of the purpose-built centres like the St George's Park centres are brilliant because of the, you know, the high tech now. You can just have a whole series of games on one pitch, and you don't have them up. So they actually work for commercial reasons. They pay for themselves, as well as offering a great variety of opportunities. But on the other hand, what we have lost, and I mentioned earlier, the work sports teams, as the great steelworks and engineering works have gone, then the facilities that they used to provide have gone as well. And we talked earlier about cricket. One of the reasons I think cricket's declined is that the provision of facilities for cricket is actually harder. You've got to have a pitch, you've got to properly do it, maintain it. The old works pitches, I had a dedicated ground, so we just don't get that out in the communities. And I think that's one of the reasons why cricket has failed and gone back. If I just come back to the issues we're talking about the value of clubs and the challenges. The reality is most people just go to the football to enjoy themselves, don't they? Lots of other things that happen are great, they're add-ons, but that's what people do. That's their form of entertainment. But you know, they do great things. That they take on kids who are struggling at maths and they bring them into the club. And it's a sense where you might come and learn something there which you wouldn't learn at school, where you're fed up and bored and not paying attention anymore. I think football's done a great job in addressing racism. You know, some of the horrible chants we used to get 30 years ago largely disappeared. You know, the bananas thrown on the pitch at the Barnes when he was playing, first of all, you know, don't happen anymore, thank goodness. They happen in some other countries, but they don't happen. So I think in that sense, challenging some of the norms that might have existed amongst the crowd, I think football's done a really good job. We've still got issues to address on sexism and homophobia, though, you know, football has stood up on these issues. One thing I think is still a problem is crowds are not representative now of modern society in a way. We talk about women spectators. Half the crowds are not women. Correct. And in some places, women don't feel you know, safe. Don't feel that they well, they have to listen to quite horrible sexist comments for a start. Also, if you look at our clubs, I mean, most of the clubs I certainly see, they're not representative in terms of ethnic makeup of the crowds. I mean, Sheffield's got 30% of the kids born in the city now are in the BME community. About 3% of football crowds come from the BME community. And they still haven't reached out, I think, and that's true of virtually all clubs in the country now. Very few are completely representative of their community. So I think there's a challenge now as communities have moved on and changed, then football hasn't necessarily kept pace.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very fair point. John, can I ask you, we've used the word heritage and how, you know, obviously all the sports we're talking about are sports on their own merits, but how do we use the heritage of the sport? How do we use, you know, the sense of place, the pride in the heritage in the community? You know, what is it that we can do to sort of talk more about that?
Well, I think
think it's a balance, isn't it, James? I think a lot of sports now are going through modernisation. We've seen some of the challenges. Wales Rugby Union would be one of them. So there is a need to modernise, but there is also a need to celebrate, reflect the sports heritage. Rugby League, 29th of August, 1895, those people sat in the room in the George Hotel in Huddersfield, and A Sport was born. And there's been some amazing moments in the sports history. I think many sports do celebrate heritage, but as we go into sort of new era, more millenniums in the workplace, Generation Z making decisions, I think it's incumbent on all leaders to make sure that the heritage is protected and also celebrated.
See, I think that politics works better, and this doesn't matter which party you're talking about, where at a very localised level, people have pride in where they're from. That can be about the bus service, about education, about all sorts of other things we're talking about. But sport and heritage is unique in linking into that sense of pride of where you're from. Bury Football Club was one of the preeminent things that made people proud to be from Bury, and that was even for people who didn't go to watch the football club. The fact that it had something with a 100-year history, you know, that had done well. It was something that was significant to the town where people lived, and that the sense of loss in respect to that was immense. I don't know if you've got any views on that, Ken.
Yeah, James, I think I mentioned that when we got promoted from the National League, I was absolutely staggered and blown away by the impact it had on local pride, and the fervour of celebration and the feel-good factor it had on that wider community was palpable, quite remarkable. So I think John rightly said it's up to the owners and the boards around them to ensure that they protect the heritage, and they recognise that the owner is only the owner in the context of the shareholding and the balance sheet, but really they're the custodian of what is a community asset.
Yvonne, can I ask you a question regarding how, you know, you've got MP sat in this room. Now I'm looking at this as a partnership between sport and politics, or sport and the state, if possible. One of the things that sport is very good at, or has been, some challenges, as Clive says, is challenging some unpleasant behaviours and some unpleasant views, whatever that may be. And I just wonder how you think potentially we all can work together to ensure that, you know, we have equality of access to sport, and that people don't go into a sporting environment feeling intimidated or feeling that they don't belong there.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, James. So if you look at a comparison, for example, between attending a men's football match, which I do often, and attending a women's football match, we've just had women's football weekend. This weekend I was at Old Trafford, you know, close to 30,000 fans there. When we look at the fact that there was no trouble at all at the Women's Euros at a sold-out Wembley Stadium, there is something culturally not quite right with the fan makeup or the acceptable behaviour or perceived acceptable behaviours within some sporting environments. And we've seen how it can be done differently. And nobody, when they go to watch women's football, is told, you can't say this, you can't do that, you can't act in this way. And yet it doesn't happen. And interestingly, sometimes there's a perception within women's football that the crowd is all women and it's all families. It is not. You know, I've been to many, many matches. It is not. There are groups of men there as well, non-binary people. The point is, it's an inclusive environment, and it's been sort of created and born that way. And actually, people are very, very protective of that and don't want to see that sort of behaviour coming into the women's game. I think from a point of view of what can we do, one of the things that I found a real challenge when we look at ED&I and we look at discrimination, you know, we'll talk about, and Clive referenced, you know, there's some fantastic work that's been done around racism and homophobia. Yes, absolutely. There's still a long way to go, just to be really clear. However, within football and wider society, yes, there has. Sexism and misogyny seems to be badged into this other forms of discrimination. And if I'm truly honest, when it's hidden like that, it's not out in it's not out for all to see and it's not visible. People still think in society that it's perfectly acceptable to speak to people in women in certain ways. We look at the work that we're doing at Women in Football and some of the women that work in the football industry. 66% of our members that replied to our survey back in 2020 said they'd experienced sexism in the workplace. Only 12% reported it. So there is something culturally wrong when more than half of the women experience sexism, but only slightly more than 10% report it, because there's a fear about how people will be judged, what action will be taken, what opportunities will be missed. And it's very similar when you go to a sporting environment. I have to say, I've been to a number of rugby matches. It doesn't feel as hostile, if I'm honest, as football. It feels quite welcoming, quite inclusive. When you go to men's football in particular, it can be quite a daunting place. And we've seen stuff with Her Game Too, talking about female fans. And when you go, your hair's too curly, you've got too much makeup on, your top's too short, or you're dressed like a man. You know, like there is literally no middle ground. So for me, there is something we have to bring sexism and misogyny right up the agenda, like homophobia, like racism, because women are not underrepresented in society. We're over half of the population, and the power that sport has to influence behaviours, to change lives, is very, very significant. We've heard about that throughout this morning. So for me, that is a fundamental thing. At the moment, those things are hidden in other. And actually, we need to just call it out for what it is. Some of this is not unpleasant behaviour; it's disgusting behaviour, and yet it's deemed to be okay.
I'm sorry, I'm going up there. Go. Can I just completely agree with that? There are chants of a racist nature that were happening 30 years ago and just would not be tolerated. Now, people wouldn't try to start them, but some of the chants involving attitudes towards women, is sometimes quite violent attitudes, are still treated as normal by some young men. We really got to recognise that that's something that needs standing out. Completely agree. I think we've got to stand up and say and call it out and make that as unacceptable as racist chants were being made over the last few years.
Paul, you got any views on that?
I'm just going to
Thank you, Clive. Cheers, thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. And just the other example you used there was about the difference between two sports. And I started off by saying I was a Newcastle fan. I was at Newcastle when the Rugby Cup came through there. And the atmosphere in the ground was completely different. It's the same town, it's the same city, sorry, but it was just completely different. I sat next to, some Scots lads watching a game, and we were against, we were cheering for the opposition. I can't remember what we were cheering for the opposition against Scotland. We had great banter all the way through. I wouldn't have experienced the same thing in a football in the football ground at that time. And that's my club I'm talking about there. So, I get that. I just want to just raise one point, James, before I forget on something completely different. I chair another APPG on Left Behind Neighbourhoods.
Yeah.
And one of the challenges we look at is, trying to revitalise some of these communities and how you get them to kickstart themselves.
Yeah.
And the question I'm pulling for me to take impact of my APPG on this is, what role sport might have in actually picking up some of those communities and finding, the people that are the good people that then become, the civic leaders or whatever you want to call them, just because they used to go in and helping people in their particular environment. So I think I'm pleased I came today, because I think that gives me another route into a different APPG, but I think it's the same space that we're talking about here.
Well, I think it is, and I think we've highlighted that, and this issue continues. I mean, one of the things, I go to Rugby League regularly, but it is what Paul says. I don't hear the behaviour that I hear when I'm a Huddersfield Town season ticket holder as well, and there is a distinct difference in the behaviour in those two grounds. And it's quite ironic, really, if you look at should we say, the nature of the sport, and they're quite, I wouldn't say aggressive, but a lot of physical contact in Rugby League. The nature of it seems to breed a different type of environment, which I'll just leave a question mark after that. I think that one of the things we talk about, this is so important on top of everything else, and we're running out of time now, is that if we look at football as we are, Wigan Athletic are in a position now where sadly they're not able to pay the wages at the moment. They're in a very desperate situation. My club, Huddersfield, were heralded 30 years ago as a trailblazer when the stadium was built. The council can't afford to maintain the stadium. They're looking to potentially give that away. We've just been sold to an unknown American consortium, which may or may not become known in the near future. There are transfer embargoes on teams that may well go into the Premier League, Burnley's and the Sheffield Uniteds of this world. So this problem continues, and the role of the state is going to become more and more, because we're going to have to decide as politicians whether it is our job to be standoff, whether we just let things take their course in a free market, or we look at the opportunities this provides. And the example we've heard today, Stockport Council, should be absolutely congratulated. That decision to invest in Edgeley Park has transformed opportunity, transformed the sense of pride in the town, transformed, something that otherwise, if the council hadn't got involved in it, would just have disappeared.
Sorry.
No, forgive me, Ken. I just going to say, whether it is addressing inequalities, whether it's addressing inappropriate behaviour, the power of sport, culture, and heritage linking in partnership with the state is fundamental, and we don't use it as much as we should do. I mean, we've got 3 minutes left, so if any of you would just like to say a few words to finish off. John, have you got anything you want to say as a sort of final comment?
Just thank you for the opportunity, James. Welcome this inquiry. I think that sense of cultural identity is enormous in the North. We should be very proud of our place, our people, and the part that sport can play in transforming lives and in places saving lives. So thank you for the opportunity, James.
Ken?
Yeah, I endorse what John's just said. It's a hugely important piece of work, as the linkage between the cultural value of these sporting institutions has never really been fully drawn out historically, I don't think. And I think the concerns you were just alluding to around Huddersfield Town and new ownership, and do we let the free market dictate the way forward? Well, the free market's got us to where we are with the financial not irregularities, the financial unfairness now that is in the football pyramid. And the white paper's exactly the right step to take to try and protect the heritage of those English football club assets.
Okay, thank you very much. Yvonne, any final thoughts?
Echo what colleagues have talked about. I think the key for me, and the role that we can play working and yourselves in the political sphere, our job is about creating the conditions, and whether that's at national, regional or local level, it's about building on strength in communities. It's about seeing people as assets, building their capabilities, genuinely co-producing solutions with them, and facilitating rather than kind of delivering. And I think we just should never lose sight of that.
Okay. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. Can I apologise to people who put comments in the chat? I'm sorry I haven't got around to some of those, but we're going to take all those points away as part of our inquiry. And can I just thank all of our brilliant panel for joining us today, speaking so passionately about what is a very, very important subject for the North. And let's hope we can continue with this discussion going forward. So thank you very much, guys. I'll bring it to an end now.
Thank you, James.
Thank you.